This isn't some story I read in a book, it's a memory that's been etched into the back of my mind. It's the story of how, at 72 years old, I learned that grief could be sharpened into a weapon. The ceremonial shovel felt cold and foreign in my hands, its polished chrome glinting under the harsh midday sun of Havenwood, Ohio. I stood on the makeshift stage, the town council flanking me, the smell of freshly turned earth filling the air. This was supposed to be Arthur's day. But then Mayor Richard Thorne, all slick hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, stepped up to the microphone and announced they were dedicating the new community park to his late father, a man who wouldn't know an oak from a maple. He said the wrong words, and in that single, gut-wrenching moment, I felt the ghost of my husband, 20 years of his planning and passion, get shoveled into the ground right along with that first symbolic scoop of dirt. My Arthur, erased. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. It had been Arthur's dream since we first moved to Havenwood 40 years ago. He was a civil engineer, a man who saw the world in blueprints and possibilities. He'd look at the derelict patch of land behind the old cannery, a forgotten dumping ground of rusted metal and stubborn weeds, and he wouldn't see decay. He saw winding paths, a duck pond for the children, a bandstand for summer concerts, and benches where old folks like us could sit and watch the world go by. He called it Arthur's Landing in his notebooks, a little joke between us. For 2 decades, he'd fought for it. He drew up the plans on his own time, presented them at countless town hall meetings, wrote letters, lobbied council members, and slowly, painstakingly, won the town over. He secured grants, organized volunteer cleanup days, and even convinced old Mr. Abernathy to donate the land to the city just before he passed. When Arthur died of a heart attack 2 years ago, the park project was his unfinished symphony. He'd gotten the funding approved and the final plans signed off on just a month before he left me. Mayor Thorne, then a fresh-faced councilman, had been Arthur's biggest supporter. He'd shaken my husband's hand, looked him in the eye, and promised to see it through. "This will be your legacy, Arthur," he'd said, his voice dripping with sincerity. "Havenwood will remember you for this." After Arthur was gone, Thorne, who had ridden a wave of popular local projects straight into the mayor's office, had called me personally. He assured me that honoring Arthur's vision was his top priority. The groundbreaking, he'd said, would be a tribute to the man who gave his heart to this town. And I, a grieving widow who wanted nothing more than to see her husband's final wish fulfilled, had believed him. I'd spent the last year working with his office, providing them with Arthur's original schematics and notes. I'd shared stories of his passion for the project with the local paper, the Havenwood Chronicle, for a feature piece they were running. I felt a quiet pride, a sense of completion. It was the last thing I could do for my husband. So there I stood, dressed in my Sunday best, a small, framed photo of Arthur tucked into my purse. The crowd was a sea of familiar faces, neighbors, friends, people who had watched Arthur pour his soul into this patch of dirt. The high school marching band had just finished a slightly off-key rendition of America the Beautiful. I was next on the schedule, set to give a short speech about Arthur's dream. Thorne stepped to the podium first, his voice booming through the speakers. He spoke of community, of legacy, of building a future for our children. It was all the right noise, the perfect political symphony. I clutched the cold shovel, my heart swelling with a bittersweet ache. Arthur would have loved this. And so, Thorne declared, his arms spread wide, it is with immense personal pride and profound respect for a great man who shaped the very bedrock of our town's commerce, that I officially dedicate this beautiful new space as the Thaddeus Thorne Memorial Park. The name hit me like a physical blow. Thaddeus Thorne. The mayor's father. A man who had owned a string of car dealerships and was famous mostly for his abrasive television commercials and a rumored tax evasion scandal in the 90s. He'd had nothing to do with this park. Nothing. The band, on cue, struck up a triumphant fanfare. The council members behind me began to applaud, their faces plastered with polite, vacant smiles. The crowd, caught up in the momentum, joined in. But for me, the world went silent. The applause was a distant, roaring wave. The shovel in my hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I looked at Thorne. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second, and in that flicker of a moment, I saw it. Not apology. Not mistake. I saw a flash of smug, dismissive victory. He knew exactly what he had done. My mind reeled. A mistake. It had to be a mistake. A typo on the speech, a miscommunication. I took a shaky step forward, my hand half raised, my mouth opening to speak. Thorne's aide, a young woman with a clipboard and an unnervingly fixed smile, gently put a hand on my arm. "Mrs. Gable, if you'll just wait a moment. The mayor has a few more words." But he didn't. He simply beamed at the crowd, soaking in their applause. He motioned for the photographer. "Let's get a shot with the ceremonial shovel," he boomed. He turned to me, his smile a mask of plastic benevolence. "Martha," he said, his voice low enough that only I and those on stage could hear, a true pillar of the community. "So glad you could be here to see this project come to fruition." He gently took the shovel from my nerveless fingers. He didn't acknowledge Arthur. He didn't acknowledge the decades of work. He just took the shovel, posed for the camera, and drove its gleaming edge into the soil that my husband had charted, dreamed of, and bled for. Humiliation washed over me, hot and sickening. I was a prop. The grieving widow, brought out to add a touch of poignant history to the mayor's grand gesture of self-aggrandizement. My speech, folded neatly in my pocket, felt like a fool's errand. It was filled with words about Arthur, about his love for this town, about his vision. Words that were now meaningless. I looked out at the faces in the crowd. Some looked confused, whispering to their neighbors. A few, the older residents who knew Arthur and his tireless crusade, looked genuinely shocked. But most just smiled and clapped, accepting the mayor's narrative without question. After all, he was the mayor. And I was just a little old lady in a floral dress. As Thorne handed the shovel off and began shaking hands, I backed away, stumbling off the side of the low stage. No one noticed. The aide was busy. The councilmen were jostling for a position in the next photo. I turned and walked away from the cheering and the music, my legs unsteady beneath me. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the property, near the old willow tree that Arthur had insisted they save. I leaned against its rough bark, my lungs burning. The photo in my purse felt heavy, a dead weight against my hip. He had not just stolen a name. He had stolen the story. He had stolen Arthur's last chapter and scrawled his own name over it. And as I stood there, hidden in the shade of that ancient tree, a cold, hard knot of something I hadn't felt in a very long time began to form in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was rage. And it was as clear and cold as ice. The mayor had made a powerful enemy that day. He just didn't know it yet. The days following the ceremony were a blur of sympathetic phone calls and pitying looks at the grocery store. "Such a shame, Martha," people would say, patting my hand. "But you know how politics are." Or, "Thorne's a good man, I'm sure there's a reason." Each platitude was a small, sharp jab, a reminder of how easily the truth could be paved over. The Havenwood Chronicle ran a front-page photo of Thorne with the shovel, his teeth gleaming. The article, written by a cub reporter, regurgitated the mayor's press release, praising his vision and his touching tribute to his father, a titan of local industry. Arthur's name was mentioned once, in passing, as one of the early proponents of the project. Early proponent. It felt like calling Noah an early proponent of boat building. I tried to fight back in the way I knew how. I wrote a letter to the editor, a carefully worded, 2-page explanation of Arthur's decades-long involvement, complete with dates and milestones. It was never published. I called the editor, a man Arthur used to play chess with, and was told they were trying to move forward and not get bogged down in town history. I scheduled a meeting with Mayor Thorne himself. I sat for 45 minutes in the sterile waiting room of his office at Town Hall, the walls covered in framed photos of him shaking hands with various Ohio dignitaries. When his aide finally called me in, Thorne was on the phone, laughing loudly. He waved me into a leather chair without looking up. When he finally hung up, he swiveled to face me, the friendly mask back in place. "Martha. So good of you to come in. I've been meaning to call." That was a lovely ceremony, wasn't it? A real shot in the arm for Havenwood. I gripped the handles of my purse, my knuckles white. "Richard," I began, my voice tighter than I intended, "we need to talk about the name of the park. There's been a terrible mistake." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. The picture of calm authority. "No mistake, Martha. A decision was made. The council and I felt it was a fitting tribute to a man who contributed so much to our town's economy." "Thaddeus Thorne had nothing to do with that park," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "That was Arthur's project. You know it was. You called it his legacy." Thorne sighed, a theatrical, patronizing sound. "Martha, I understand this is emotional for you. Arthur was a wonderful man, a great asset to this community. And his early work on the park proposal was invaluable, it truly was. But projects evolve. New leadership brings new perspective. My father was a visionary of a different sort. He built businesses. He created jobs. This park, in many ways, is a symbol of the prosperity he helped build. It was a masterclass in political doublespeak. He was dismissing 2 decades of my husband's life as early work and invaluable in the same way you'd call a kindergartner's drawing artistic. He was twisting reality into a shape that suited him, and he was doing it with a placid smile. I felt a surge of fury. "You promised him, Richard. You promised me." His smile tightened at the edges. The mask was slipping. "I promised to see the park completed, and I have. I think Arthur would be thrilled to see it looking so beautiful. It's a shame to let semantics get in the way of celebrating such a wonderful community achievement." Semantics. The word hung in the air between us, an insult of staggering arrogance. My husband's name, his life's final work, was semantics. That was the moment I knew this was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of theft. I stood up, my chair scraping against the polished floor. "This isn't over," I said, my voice low and steady. Thorne stood as well, his demeanor shifting from condescending to vaguely menacing. He was taller than I remembered, his shadow falling over me. "Martha," he said, his voice losing its political smoothness, "I strongly suggest you let this go. You're a respected member of this community. It would be a shame for you to tarnish that, or Arthur's memory, by becoming a nuisance. Enjoy the park. It's what he would have wanted." It was a threat, wrapped in a silken bow of concern. He was telling me to sit down, shut up, and be the grieving widow everyone expected me to be. As I walked out of that office, the aide's fixed smile following me, I knew that a nuisance was exactly what I was going to become. He had taken Arthur's name off the park, I was going to take Richard Thorne's name off the mayor's office door. I just had no idea how. That night, I went up to the attic, to the corner where Arthur's old things were stored. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old paper. Under a canvas tarp was his old drafting table and dozens of cardboard boxes, meticulously labeled in his neat, architectural script. I pulled one out. Havenwood Park Project, 2005 to 2010. I untied the twine, and a cascade of paper and memories spilled out. Blueprints, grant applications, soil analysis reports, and thick stacks of correspondence. For the next several hours, I sat on the dusty floor, surrounded by the ghost of my husband's work, and I began to read. I was no longer just a grieving wife. I was a researcher, and this was my archive. And somewhere in these boxes, I prayed, was the key to tearing down Richard Thorne's perfectly constructed world. For the next 3 weeks, the attic became my sanctuary and my war room. By day, I was Martha Gable, the quiet widow who tended her garden and returned her library books on time. But by night, I was an archaeologist, digging through the sedimentary layers of my husband's life's work. I organized the boxes chronologically, creating a timeline that spanned nearly 20 years. The sheer volume of it was staggering. Arthur had saved everything. Every letter, every meeting agenda, every scribbled note on a napkin. It was a testament to his meticulous nature, a quality I had sometimes found maddening in life, but was now profoundly grateful for in his death. At first, I was just looking for a smoking gun, a signed contract, a letter from Thorne explicitly promising to name the park after Arthur. But there was nothing that concrete. It had all been handshakes and verbal agreements, the kind of gentleman's promises that politicians like Thorne treat as disposable. But as I delved deeper, I started to notice things that were less obvious, small inconsistencies that pricked at the edges of my mind. I was a retired reference librarian from the county library. I had spent 40 years of my life finding needles in haystacks of information. My brain was trained to see patterns, to spot the detail that didn't fit. The first thread appeared in a file from 2018. It was the year Thorne, then a city councilman, became the official liaison for the park project. According to Arthur's notes, that's when things really started moving forward. But it was also when the expenses started to change. I found the original bids for the landscaping work from a reputable company in Columbus, Greenscape Solutions. Their proposal was detailed and reasonably priced. But stapled behind it was a newer contract, dated 6 months later, with a company I'd never heard of, Evergreen Municipal Services. Their bid was nearly 30% higher. On the bottom of the contract, signed by Thorne on behalf of the council, was a small, almost unreadable handwritten note, per council review, Evergreen selected for superior local sourcing. I didn't remember Arthur ever mentioning them. I went to my laptop, the dial-up tone a familiar, screeching sound in the quiet house. I searched for Evergreen Municipal Services. The company had a bare-bones website, listing a P.O. box in a neighboring county as its address. There were no pictures of completed projects, no client testimonials. Just a generic logo of a green leaf and a phone number. I dug into the Ohio Secretary of State's business registry. The LLC was formed just 2 weeks before the contract was awarded. The registered agent and sole officer listed was a man named Marcus Thorne, the mayor's cousin. My heart began to beat a little faster. It was more than just stealing a name. This was something else. This was grift. I started cross-referencing every contract signed after Thorne took over the project. A pattern emerged, as clear as day. The irrigation system contract went to Aquaflow Systems, a company registered to Thorne's brother-in-law. The paving for the walking paths was awarded to Midwest Asphalt, whose owner was a man who had donated heavily to Thorne's mayoral campaign. In every case, the winning bid was significantly higher than the competitors, and the company was connected, in some way, to Richard Thorne. He hadn't just championed Arthur's project, he'd hijacked it. He was using it as his personal piggy bank, funneling city money to his friends and family under the guise of community improvement. Arthur's dream, the one he had scrimped and saved for, the one he had poured his very soul into, was being used to line the pockets of a corrupt politician. The rage I'd felt at the ceremony returned, but now it was cold and sharp. It had a direction. I knew I couldn't go to the police. The chief, Bill Patterson, was a golfing buddy of Thorne's. I couldn't go to the town council. They had all signed off on the contracts, either out of complicity or incompetence. And the local paper had already shown its loyalty. I was alone in this. A 72-year-old woman against a popular, powerful mayor with the entire town apparatus at his disposal. He had called me a nuisance. He wanted me to be a nuisance. Fine. I would be the most meticulous, well-documented, and dangerously underestimated nuisance he had ever seen. My strategy began to form. I couldn't just accuse him, I needed irrefutable proof. The kind of proof that couldn't be dismissed as the ramblings of a bitter old woman. I started leaving the house more, but not for my usual errands. I took drives. I drove past the address listed for Midwest Asphalt, which turned out to be a small, dilapidated house with 2 rusted cars in the yard, not the headquarters of a major paving company. I called Evergreen Municipal Services, pretending to be a resident interested in landscaping for my garden club. The man who answered sounded flustered and confused, and when I asked for a portfolio of their work, he stammered that they mostly did city contracts and didn't have one. I went back to the town hall, But this time I didn't ask to see the mayor. I went to the records office, a dusty basement room managed by a woman named Carol who was 2 years away from retirement and hated her job. I used to help her son with his history papers. I feigned a newfound interest in civic procedure. Since Arthur passed, I've just felt so disconnected, I told her, putting a tremble in my voice. I want to understand how our town works. All those things Arthur used to handle. Carol, bored and sympathetic, was happy to help. Over the next 2 weeks, I spent hours at that records office, requesting zoning changes, budget proposals, and public meeting minutes from the last 5 years. I told Carol I was thinking of creating a small civic history archive for the library. She let me use the photocopy machine for 10 cents a page. I copied everything. I documented every variance Thorne had pushed through, every budget line item that seemed inflated. I found a zoning change for a new condominium development on the edge of town, a project Thorne had championed as smart growth. The developer was a shell corporation based in Delaware, but by cross-referencing campaign donation records, I traced it back to a holding company owned by, to my utter lack of surprise, another one of Thorne's cousins. He was selling off Havenwood piece by piece to his own family. The sheer scale of his corruption was breathtaking. He wasn't just a thief, he was an architect of decay, hollowing out the town from the inside while wearing a smile and cutting ribbons. The park wasn't the beginning, it was his masterpiece. It was the most visible, most beloved project in town, the perfect cover for his biggest payday. And by putting his father's name on it, he wasn't just erasing Arthur, he was signing his work, a monument to his own arrogance. He believed he was untouchable. He believed no one was smart enough, or brave enough, to look behind the curtain. He certainly didn't think a grieving widow with a library card could piece it all together. That was his mistake. He saw a frail old woman. He should have seen a librarian. And he was about to find out just how much damage a librarian could do. The more I uncovered, the more invincible Richard Thorne seemed. He had woven his network of corruption so tightly into the fabric of Havenwood that it was hard to see where the town ended and his personal enterprise began. He was a king in his own small kingdom. At a town hall meeting in late September, I decided to test the waters. It was a standard agenda, a debate over new parking meters downtown, a report from the sanitation department. During the open forum at the end, I walked to the microphone, my hands trembling slightly, a single index card clutched between my fingers. When I stated my name, a murmur went through the room. I have a question about the budget allocation for the new park, I said, my voice amplified and sounding stronger than I felt. Specifically regarding the landscaping contract awarded to Evergreen Municipal Services. The final cost was nearly a third higher than the initial bid from a more established firm. Could the mayor explain the council's reasoning for this decision? All eyes turned to Thorne, who was seated at the center of the raised dais, looking utterly unconcerned. He gave me that familiar, pitying smile. Martha, thank you for your question. As I believe I explained to you privately, we made the decision to go with Evergreen because of their commitment to using local nurseries and hiring Havenwood residents. It's about investing in our own community. Sometimes, that costs a little more upfront, but the long-term benefits are immeasurable. The council members nodded sagely. A few people in the audience applauded. He was so smooth, so plausible. He'd spun nepotism into a heartwarming tale of local pride. I tried to push back. But the company itself isn't based here, and my research suggests they have very little experience. Furthermore, the company is owned by Marcus Thorne, your cousin. Doesn't that represent a conflict of interest? The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The polite silence was replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Thorne's smile vanished. I resent that implication, Martha, he said, his voice turning hard as steel. My cousin's business was awarded that contract on its own merits, through the proper channels, and was approved unanimously by the council. We have strict ethics rules in Havenwood, and they were followed to the letter. I'm sorry if your grief has led you to see shadows where there are none, but I will not have my family's name or my integrity questioned in a public forum based on hearsay and innuendo. It was a public execution. He had simultaneously dismissed my valid concern, accused me of being an emotional, confused old woman, and painted himself as the victim of a malicious attack. He'd invoked my grief like a weapon against me. I saw some of my own neighbors, people I'd known for 30 years, shaking their heads with looks of second-hand embarrassment. I stood at the microphone, utterly defeated, as Thorne banged his gavel. "We are out of time for public comment." Meeting adjourned. He didn't look at me again. Walking home that night, the autumn air felt sharp and cold. I had been naive. Facts didn't matter when the person in power controlled the narrative. Thorne didn't need to disprove my claims, he just needed to discredit the claimant. And he had done it perfectly. The next day, there was a small piece in the Chronicle about the meeting. It mentioned my emotional outburst and praised the mayor for his grace and professionalism in the face of a personal attack. Thorne had even given them a quote, "My heart goes out to Mrs. Gable. Loss can affect people in unforeseen ways. We on the council will continue to keep her in our thoughts." He was pouring honey on my public humiliation. The threats became less subtle after that. A police car started parking across the street from my house for an hour or two every day. Just sitting there. When I called the station to ask why, Chief Patterson told me they were increasing patrols in the neighborhood for my safety, given my recent state of distress. It was a clear message, "We are watching you." Then came the citation from the city. A notice taped to my front door claiming my rose bushes, the ones Arthur had planted for me on our 10th anniversary, were encroaching on the public sidewalk by 4 inches and needed to be trimmed back or I would face a daily fine. They had never been a problem in 40 years. He was trying to bury me in 1,000 tiny cuts, to make my life so frustrating and unpleasant that I would simply give up. He wanted me to retreat back into my quiet, widow's life. And for a moment, I almost did. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the ridiculous citation, the sheer petty cruelty of it all washing over me. I was tired. I was 72 years old. My husband was gone. What was I doing, taking on a man who held all the cards? Perhaps he was right. Perhaps I was just a confused old woman lost in her grief. I looked around the quiet house, at the photos of Arthur on the mantelpiece, at his favorite armchair still sitting in the corner. Grief wasn't making me see shadows. Grief was the lantern that was showing me the truth. Thorne had underestimated my grief. He thought it was my weakness. He had no idea it was the source of my strength. That evening, I was pruning the offending rose bushes, my hands aching with the cold, when a car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a police car. A young man got out, maybe in his late 20s, with a notepad in his hand and an anxious energy about him. "Mrs. Gable?" he asked, approaching my walkway hesitantly. "My name is Ben Carter. I'm a reporter with the Buckeye Sentinel." The Sentinel was the paper from Columbus, the state capital. A real newspaper. "I was in the back of the room at that town hall meeting the other night," he said. "I was doing a follow-up on a state infrastructure grant, and, well, what you said caught my attention. And the way the mayor shut you down, it felt heavy-handed. I did a little digging on Evergreen Municipal Services. You were right. The whole thing stinks." I stopped pruning, the shears hanging limp in my hand. I looked at him, really looked at him. He was young, hungry, and he wasn't part of Thorne's kingdom. He was an outsider. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't anger or sorrow. It was hope. "Mr. Carter," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "my husband kept very detailed records. Would you be interested in seeing them?" His eyes lit up. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd be honored." I led him inside, away from the prying eyes of the police car that was now parked at the end of the block. I put on a pot of coffee, and then I went up to the attic. I came back down with the first of many boxes. Thorne hadn't just declared war on a widow. He had declared war on her husband's memory. And Arthur was about to start fighting back from beyond the grave. My resolve, which had wavered for just a moment, now solidified into something unbreakable. Richard Thorne thought he was untouchable. He was about to find out that a librarian, a reporter, and a ghost make for a formidable team. Ben Carter became a regular visitor at my kitchen table. He'd drive in from Columbus 2 or 3 times a week, his beat-up Honda Civic a welcome sight outside my window. He was a revelation. Where I had raw data, piles of contracts, invoices, and meeting minutes, Ben had the context and the tools to weaponize it. He knew how to file Freedom of Information Act requests, how to navigate arcane state databases, and how to connect the dots in a way that would stand up to legal scrutiny. We were an unlikely pair, the septuagenarian archivist and the millennial journalist, united by a shared conviction that Richard Thorne was a cancer on this town. For hours, we would sift through Arthur's files, which I had now organized into a color-coded system of binders on my dining room table. Green tabs were for suspicious contracts, yellow for campaign finance connections, and red for direct conflicts of interest. Ben would scan documents into his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard, muttering to himself as he uncovered another shell corporation or another falsified address. "This guy's not just crooked, Mrs. Gable," he said one afternoon, shaking his head in disbelief. "He's an artist. He's built a masterpiece of municipal fraud." Our investigation deepened, moving beyond the park. Ben's FOIA request started yielding results. We found that the new condominium project, Havenwood Heights, had been approved for a massive tax abatement, a 10-year deal that would cost the town millions in revenue. The justification was job creation, but the documents showed the developer had only committed to hiring 12 permanent employees. The developer, of course, was the Delaware corporation we traced back to Thorne's family. He was robbing the town's future to enrich his present. We also uncovered the mechanism. Thorne had a slush fund, essentially. He used the Parks and Recreation budget, which was notoriously complex and less scrutinized than other departments, to hide his overexpenditures. He would approve inflated invoices from his cronies' companies for park maintenance or event supplies, and they would kick back a portion to a consulting firm he controlled. It was a classic, dirty scheme, but he'd managed it for years because no one was looking closely. No one had a reason to. Until he stole my husband's legacy. That was the loose thread he never anticipated. As we built our case, the pressure from Thorne escalated. The police car was a permanent fixture now. I started getting anonymous calls at night. No one would speak, but I could hear breathing on the other end of the line. It was meant to intimidate me, to make me feel isolated and vulnerable. It had the opposite effect. Every silent call, every stare from the officer in that cruiser, just fueled the cold fire inside me. Thorne was afraid. He knew I was digging, and he was trying to scare me off the scent. The turning point came when Ben uncovered Thorne's endgame. It wasn't just about the small-time grift and nepotism. It was bigger. A state-level initiative was underway to select a location for a new regional distribution center for a massive online retailer, a project that would bring thousands of jobs and millions in investment. Several towns in our part of Ohio were in the running. The deciding factor was land and infrastructure. Thorne was positioning Havenwood to win the bid. The condo development, the new roads he was pushing for, it was all part of a plan to make the land adjacent to his cousin's new development the most attractive site. If Havenwood won the bid, the value of that land, and the condos, would skyrocket. Thorne and his family stood to make a fortune, not just from the corrupt construction deals, but from the land itself. And the Thaddeus Thorne Memorial Park was the public relations jewel meant to distract everyone, a beautiful, expensive lie to show what a forward-thinking, community-minded mayor he was. "He's not just robbing the town, Martha," Ben said, his voice grim as he laid out the final pieces of the puzzle on my kitchen table. "He's using your husband's dream as the centerpiece and the biggest con of his career." That was it. That was the moment my quiet, methodical quest for justice transformed into a full-blown declaration of war. He had taken the purest thing Arthur had ever built and used it as a tool to commit a grander evil. It was no longer enough to expose him. I had to destroy him. I wanted to see that smug smile wiped from his face, to see his carefully constructed world crumble around him until there was nothing left but the truth. Our strategy shifted. We couldn't just leak the story to the paper. Thorne would deny everything, sue for libel, and use his political machine to crush Ben and discredit me. We needed to detonate it all at once, in a way he couldn't control. We needed a public execution of our own. Ben found our stage. In 2 weeks, the Ohio Municipal League was holding its annual conference at a large hotel and convention center in Columbus. Mayor Thorne was the keynote speaker for the final day. He was going to give a speech titled Building Tomorrow's Hometowns, a model for ethical governance. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. It was his moment of triumph, a stepping stone for his ambitions for higher office. Representatives from every major city in the state would be there, as would the state press corps. And, most importantly, the committee selecting the site for the distribution center was scheduled to be in attendance. It was the perfect venue. "We can't get on the agenda," Ben said, pacing my living room. "Security will be tight." "We don't need to be on the agenda," I replied, a plan forming in my mind, cold and clear as glass. "I'm a 72-year-old widow from his hometown. Who's going to stop me from coming to watch my own mayor give a speech?" For the next 2 weeks, we prepared for battle. Ben worked with his editor at the Sentinel to prepare a massive exposé, ready to be published online at a moment's notice. He created a detailed PowerPoint presentation, complete with scanned copies of the fraudulent contracts, bank transfer records he'd managed to subpoena through the paper's lawyers, and a complex flowchart that showed the flow of money from the town's coffers into the Thorne family's pockets. My job was simpler, but far more terrifying. I had to be the one to deliver the blow. The day of the conference, I dressed carefully. Not in my usual floral prints, but in a simple, elegant navy blue suit that I hadn't worn since Arthur's funeral. I looked professional. Serious. Unemotional. Ben picked me up before dawn. He was a nervous wreck, triple-checking his audio recorder and the USB drive that held our presentation. I, on the other hand, felt a strange, unnerving calm. I had grieved. I had raged. I had investigated. Now, all that was left was the execution. We walked into the convention center's grand ballroom and took seats near the back. The room was filled with hundreds of people in suits, mayors, city managers, lobbyists. A large screen hung above the stage, currently displaying the Municipal League's logo. Thorne's aide was bustling around, handing out press kits with the mayor's smiling face on the cover. She didn't even notice me. To her, I was just another face in the crowd, invisible. It was the last time anyone would ever make that mistake. As Richard Thorne was introduced to thunderous applause, I clutched the small remote for the presentation in my pocket. He strode to the podium, beaming, the picture of success. He had no idea he was walking to his own guillotine. The applause for Mayor Richard Thorne was deafening. He stood at the podium, basking in it, a portrait of civic virtue. He smoothed his tie, adjusted the microphone, and flashed his practiced, 1,000-watt smile at the packed ballroom. Thank you," he began, his voice resonating with false humility. "It's an honor to be here today, to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, the future of Ohio's towns and the sacred trust we hold as public servants." I sat in the back, my heart a cold, steady drum against my ribs. Ben was beside me, looking pale, his laptop open and ready. He had already found a friendly AV technician, a young man who hated his job and was more than happy to accept a $100 bill in exchange for plugging a backup USB drive into the main presentation computer. He'd been told it was for a surprise tribute video. It was a lie, one of the many I'd grown comfortable with over the past few months. In war, you use the enemy's tactics. Thorne launched into his speech. It was the usual mix of empty platitudes and buzzwords: synergy, public-private partnerships, grassroots innovation. He spoke of Havenwood as a shining example, a town reborn under his leadership. And then, he did the one thing I was counting on him to do. He brought up the park. "Just last month," he boomed, "we dedicated a new community park, a beautiful green space built on forgotten land. We named it in honor of a local business legend, a man who embodied the spirit of hard work and prosperity, my father, Thaddeus Thorne." A picture of the park's entrance, with the new sign prominently displayed, flashed onto the giant screen behind him. This park, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, is more than just a place for families to gather. It is a symbol of our commitment to honoring our past as we build our future. That was my cue. It was now or never. I stood up. My movement was small, but in the focused silence of the ballroom, it was enough to draw a few eyes. I began to walk, not towards the stage, but down the side aisle, towards the small table where the AV technician sat. He saw me coming and, as planned, averted his eyes, suddenly fascinated by the cables at his feet. Ben hit a key on his laptop. On the massive screen behind Thorne, the picture of the park sign vanished. It was replaced by a scanned copy of the first document from my red binder, the contract awarded to Evergreen Municipal Services, with the ridiculously inflated price and the signature of Richard Thorne at the bottom. Underneath it, in bold red letters, was the name of its owner, Marcus Thorne, cousin of Mayor Thorne. The mayor, unaware, continued his speech. A future built on a foundation of integrity and... He faltered. A confused murmur was spreading through the audience as they stared at the screen behind him. He glanced over his shoulder. The blood drained from his face. His confident smile froze, then collapsed. He looked out into the crowd, his eyes frantically searching, and for a moment, they landed on me as I reached the side of the room. I gave him a small, tight smile. The smile of a nuisance who had just become his worst nightmare. "What is this?" he stammered into the microphone, his voice cracking. "There seems to be a technical difficulty." Ben hit another key. The slide changed. Now it was the Aquaflow Systems contract, owned by his brother-in-law. Click. The Midwest Asphalt contract, owned by his biggest campaign donor. Click. A complex flowchart appeared, the one Ben had so meticulously designed, showing the labyrinthine path of public money from the Havenwood Parks Department budget into the pockets of Thorne's family and friends. The room was buzzing now, people pointing at the screen, pulling out their phones to take pictures. "Turn it off." Thorne hissed at the AV tech, but the young man just shrugged, pointing to his screen as if the problem were a mystery to him. This was my moment. I walked from the side of the room toward a floor microphone set up for the Q&A session. I was no longer invisible. Every eye in the room was on me, this old woman in a navy suit, walking with a calm, deliberate pace toward the center of the unfolding chaos. I reached the microphone just as a new slide appeared on the screen, a side-by-side comparison of the developer's proposal for the Havenwood Heights condominium project and the massive, 10-year tax abatement Thorne had personally pushed through the council. I didn't have to shout. The room was falling silent, a vacuum of shock and anticipation. "My name is Martha Gable," I said, my voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the ballroom. "I am a resident of Havenwood, Ohio. My late husband, Arthur Gable, was the man who designed, championed, and secured the funding for the park Mayor Thorne just dedicated to his own father." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thorne stood at the podium, paralyzed, a statue of impotent fury. "For the last 2 decades of his life," I continued, my voice never wavering, "my husband poured his soul into that project. Mayor Thorne gave him his word it would be his legacy. Instead, he stole my husband's name and used his dream as a smokescreen to facilitate the most audacious campaign of corruption this state has seen in a generation." Ben kept the slides coming. Bank records. Falsified invoices. Campaign finance reports showing quid pro quo donations. It was an avalanche of evidence, projected 10 feet high for the entire Ohio political establishment to see. At the same moment, Ben hit publish. The Buckeye Sentinel's website went live with their massive expose, complete with copies of all our documents and interviews with disgruntled former city employees whom Ben had tracked down. Phones all over the ballroom started buzzing with the news alert. I spoke for 10 minutes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply, methodically, and with the cold precision of a librarian who knows her subject inside and out, laid out the entire conspiracy. I told them about the shell companies, the kickbacks, the slush fund, the land deal. I presented the truth not as an accusation, but as a lecture, a history lesson on the anatomy of a betrayal. When I finished, there was a moment of absolute, profound silence. The entire room just stared, first at me, then at the man on the stage, who now looked small and utterly broken. The grand curtain had been pulled back, and the wizard was just a pathetic, greedy man. Then, from the back of the room, two men in dark suits stood up and began walking down the center aisle toward the stage. They were followed by another two. State auditors. FBI agents. Ben had made the anonymous tip an hour ago. They didn't rush. They walked with the unhurried confidence of men who knew the fight was already over. They flanked the stage, their presence a silent, damning verdict. The keynote speech on ethical governance was over. Richard Thorne's political career was over. His freedom was about to be over. He looked from the approaching agents to the damning evidence on the screen, and then his eyes found mine one last time. There was no smugness left. There was no arrogance. There was only the hollow, dawning horror of a man who had underestimated his enemy, a man who had been so thoroughly and completely destroyed that there was nothing left to salvage. He had picked a fight with a ghost, and the ghost had won. The end.